Neuville-Saint-Vaast was nothing but a pile of ruins. Our section was lodged in the cellar of a lawyer's house, which everyone who passed through Neuville knew well. This dark and humid cellar was filled with all kinds of unspeakable waste and gave off a sickening odour. With our entrenching tools, each one of us cleared a spot to lie down and rest after our little stroll of more than 12 hours in the trenches. In the afternoon, my friend Gayraud, the colonel's barber, the pride of the 13th Squad, to which he still nominally belonged, paid me a visit. The squad is like a little family, a centre of affection where deep feelings prevail, of solidarity, mutual devotion, intimacy, and from which the officer and even the sergeant are excluded. To them, the soldier doesn't open up, is mistrustful, and any officer who will want to try to describe the strange life of the trenches, as I'm doing, will never have known, except by accident, the real sentiments, the true spirit, the clear language, and the deepest thoughts of the soldier. So that he would always have his barber at hand, the colonel had named Gayraud his personal orderly. In this spot, he knew all the inside news, which he hastened to tell us. Knowing that I was writing the true account of our dolorous Calvary, he brought me precious bits of intelligence that even the superior officers didn't know. This time, the ex-barber from Villelong didn't bring very uplifting news. General Niesel wasn't going to let us get mouldy in this unhealthy cellar. But it wasn't because he cared about our hygiene. That wasn't what mattered. That evening we had to attack the fatal village of Farbus once again. To prevent a repeat of yesterday's confusion, the runners carefully reconnoitred the connecting trenches leading to the front lines. Our regiment was supposed to move out at 5 p.m. The exact timing of our attack was kept secret from the men until the very last moment for morale purposes. In reality, they didn't want to give the soldiers time to organize any sort of resistance to orders. Our officers couldn't believe that in the 20th century, free men would allow themselves to be led to the slaughter, without knowing why or how. At 4:30 they brought up the evening meal. We weren't used to being served so early in the day. "That's nice, now they're really spoiling us," someone said. We had hardly gulped down the last mouthful, when, to everyone's stupefaction except mine, the officers ordered us to hoist our packs. 10 minutes later, by way of 3 different connecting trenches, the regiment moved briskly up toward Farbus, where we would be unleashed like a rushing torrent, flanked to the right and the left by the other regiments of the division. But we had hardly gone 500 metres when we stopped for a good while. What was going on? At the crossroads of 2 connecting trenches, where we had arrived either too early or too late, we had to make way for another battalion to pass ahead of us. We took off at a run, then halted, then pulled back. Then we were crammed into a dead-end trench to let the units which were being relieved make their way back to the rear. For several hours it was like this. Halts, pullbacks, spurts ahead. Night fell, and so did the rain, in torrents, soaking us to the bone and filling the trenches, turning them into muddy morasses. What a pretty sight we would make when we finally got around to attacking this damned Farbus. All of a sudden we all shuddered as a lively fusillade burst over our heads, followed by cries and shouts. What happened? Had we finally reached Farbus? No, it was like this. Without realizing it, the 23rd Company, which preceded our own, had gone past our forward listening posts into no man's land, and fell right into a German trench and a welcoming hailstorm of bullets. Evidently that all went according to plan. Out of fear that we wouldn't attack, they decided to push us beyond our forward positions without telling us. Once we were right on top of the Germans, we would have to take care of ourselves and make the best of it. This crude trick could have had grave consequences, and it shows the villainous mentality of our leaders. It did nothing to raise their prestige in our eyes, or to diminish the mistrust which they inspired in us. The men of the 23rd Company hit the ground until the hail of gunfire subsided. Then they came rushing back in disarray, throwing the whole regiment into a confused panic. There were plenty of dead and wounded in that company. Around midnight, our company found ourselves in a completely collapsed trench, where all the dugouts, even the deepest ones, were caved in. This had been the German front line which our troops had taken on September 25th. We spent the rest of the night there. At daybreak, we could see, to our horror, that in front of the trench and behind it, the ground was covered with hundreds of French bodies. Complete lines, entire ranks of foot soldiers had been mowed down. This was the price paid for an advance of 400 or 500 metres, something like 1 human life per square metre. While our dispatches sang about our victories, they could have been bordered in black. That day I was exploring a communication trench nearby, when I was surprised to find myself in the presence of a German, seated, apparently wounded, who gave me a terrified look. "Kamerad! Kamerad!" he stammered. I approached him and saw that he was badly wounded in one leg and had an eye swollen shut. I gave him a couple of sips of peppermint schnapps, which comforted him both physically and mentally, because I think he was expecting a bayonet thrust instead of a helping hand. I went to find my comrades, who ran up. The prisoner was revived, fed, refreshed with a hefty swig of pinard, and led along the trench. Well, what do you know? This was the 13th Squad's first prisoner. You wouldn't have believed the astounded look he had on his face. Just then our commandant, nicknamed Quinzagrams, passed by and said to me, "What's all the fuss about?" "It's a wounded German we found in a communication trench. If you want to have a look, he's right over there." "I'm not interested," said Quinzagram, who continued along his way. What was one more wounded German to a stripe-sleeved big shot like Quinzagrams? The stretcher-bearers said that they would take care of the German wounded only once all the French wounded had been taken away. From a humanitarian viewpoint, this was grossly unjust, but from a French viewpoint it was perfectly logical. As it happened, before nightfall, the wounded German and several of his comrades whom we had snagged in the communication trenches were taken back to the dressing station. At 4 p.m. the order came to hoist our packs. Were we going to relieve another unit? Were we just moving from one place to another? Or were we mounting another attack on this phantom village of Farbus, which we had been straining our eyes to glimpse all day long? We first followed the main trench to the left. Then our section alone entered a deep, narrow boyau, heading forward. Had there been hand-to-hand combat here? Had wounded and dying men dragged themselves to this spot? Whatever had happened, there were numerous bodies of Frenchmen and Germans, whom death had surprised in every conceivable pose. Lying, kneeling, crouched down. The boyau was narrow, and we were forced to step on corpses. What a horror that was. All of a sudden, right in front of the head of the section, came a burst of grenade blasts, followed by furious cries, shrieks, moans. Voices yelled, "Fall back! It's the Boches! Run like hell!" Our boyau ran right into the main German trench. We had come up against a German advance party that proceeded to massacre, with hand grenades, those of us who were at the front of the column, who had been moving along imprudently, expecting to relieve a squad of fellow Frenchmen. Our leaders must have known that we would bump into the Germans. Why not warn us? Why not give us the chance to take every precaution which would apply to an advance into a dangerous boyau? Well, it was always the same reason. They feared that we would refuse to go forward, that we would confront their orders with our passivity, with the strength and power of our inertia. When our leaders had to sink to such stratagems to get their troops to march, it shows that there is no reciprocal confidence, that there is a complete divergence of interests. The bosses are interested only in chalking up a success to make it worthwhile. The men, who have everything to lose and nothing to gain, who don't know why they're there, who are looking only to escape any danger they can and to save their skins. It's human nature. In the narrow boyau filled with the sounds of massacre, our column was slow to execute an about-face. Each terrified soldier tried to clamber out of the trench and make his way back through the brush, across open country. I tried to do the same, but the weight of my pack prevented it. I couldn't even unbuckle the strap to get it off me. I was finally able to get rid of it and to get out of the trench, one of the last to do so before the Germans swept through the trench. Night was falling, and I could make my way in the open without being seen. I arrived at a trench occupied by the 108th Infantry Regiment. The soldiers, alerted by our cries, had fixed bayonets and were ready to open fire. "Hurry up!" they called out to me. "Get out of our line of fire!" They told me what had happened and showed me the way to the trenches occupied by the 280th. After 10 minutes, I arrived at the entrance to the boyau. At this point, the trench was quite wide, like a sunken road. Our cowardly captain, Cromereviaille, was there. "It's shameful what happened out there," he cried. "Get back out into the trench." But nobody budged. If Captain Cromereviaille had put himself in front of us, we all would have followed him. At this moment, Agusol, an epileptic who for some time had shown signs of mental weakness, but whom we had kept with us all the same, lost his mind. Hearing that we were being ordered back into the trench where we had had such a frightful time, he advanced on the captain and swung an empty musette bag at him, by the straps, smacking him in the face and knocking his spectacles off. Then he charged off into the trench, shouting and singing the verses of a battle song. "The air is pure, the road is wide, the bugler sounds the charge." He disappeared into the falling night, and then all was silent. The next day we found his body, riddled with bullets, along the Boyau. Once again we made our way along the dark corridor. This time a team of grenadiers was at the head of the column, lobbing grenades continuously as we advanced. No more Germans. They were no doubt waiting for us in their trench. Someone decided it was a good idea to halt about 50 meters before reaching it, and we waited for orders. From this moment, the daily rain began to fall, and continued all night long in heavy downpours. The attack was postponed until the next day. We spent a miserable night there, without any shelter at all, soaked to our shirts, shivering with cold. We envied the poor dead men who littered the Boyau. They at least weren't suffering anymore. One each squad took turns standing watch at the head of the column. Around midnight, our sub-lieutenant Malvesi, who wisely kept to the rear of the section, passed us a note which we read with Sergeant Farr, by the light of an electric lamp. It was an order to move up in the Boyau. The men started to protest violently at word of this order. They didn't have any spirit of adventure. They weren't curious at all. The sergeant was perplexed. I suggested that he respond this way. The men ask that the section chief lead them at the head of the column. He scribbled down these few words, and the note was passed back, from hand to the prudent Malvesi, who decided not to press the matter any further. He would have to earn his second lieutenant's stripe on his own. We weren't going to earn it for him. At first light we yielded our place, without much pleading, to another section which came to relieve us. We weren't going far in reserve, only back to the nearest trench, practically at the entrance to the Boyau, where we had spent such a miserable night. In a corner of the Boyau, we discovered a German officer's shelter where we set up lodging. In this shelter there were some illustrated German newspapers. In one of them, our Joffre was depicted sleeping on a bed. Sweat dripped from his body in the form of great drops of blood that he had caused to flow in vain and futile offensives. Another showed Joffre on horseback, advancing at the head of a vast army which is halted by insurmountable tangles of barbed wire protecting a German trench, where only 3 or 4 machine gunners stand guard, bottles of beer under their arms, enjoying a snack while firing their machine gun, producing a pile of slaughtered Frenchmen. We were all set to spend a comfortable night in this shelter, which would have brought us some well-earned rest, but the butcher Niesel had decided on another attack that very afternoon at 5 o'clock. We made our way up the Boyau des Morts, where we had just spent such a disagreeable night. There was a long wait, as usual. Then the order came to fix bayonets. We passed from hand to hand the order from Commandant Quinze-Grams, telling the officer of the lead section to report back every 10 minutes about what was happening. How curious he was, our commandant, and how prudent, too. This aroused the anger of the men, who without scruple unfolded and read the note. "Let him come up here himself to see what happens. Let him get out of his hole," cried rough voices. One soldier, I don't know any more who it was, tore the note to pieces, to the approving laughter of those watching. Each one had come to the same resolution. We would not attack, we would not move out from the Boyau. The word went from the front to the rear and back again, at least 20 times. Pass the word, we're not attacking. Some may call this cowardice, but mounting an attack against sturdy, well-defended trenches, protected by thick barbed wire entanglements, without the slightest artillery fire beforehand, wouldn't you call that criminal? Along the whole front, the offensive had failed lamentably. Only Niesel persisted in wanting to attack day and night. If he couldn't take Douai, he wanted Farbus, no matter what the cost, so that they could say, "Here is Nisel, the conqueror of Farbus." Beside me, Father Galaup told me that if the order came, saying "forward," his priest's conscience would compel him to go forth, even if he were the only one. "I have one favour to ask you," he said. "If I'm killed in the attack, I beg you not to leave me unburied out there. Nothing horrifies me more than the thought of being prey to the rats and the crows." I promised him nothing. "Do you seriously think," I answered him, "that if you're crazy enough to go out there on your own, we're going to risk our lives to go pull your body off the barbed wire?" Bothered by this, the Holy Father Galop thought a moment, then asked me, "Would you give me a counter-order to come back to the Boyau after the order comes to attack?" "Sure, if that's what you need. I'll even grab you by your coattails and haul you back into the Boyau," I promised him. His conscience would be clear, his responsibility disengaged. Having reconciled his patriotic priestly duties with the desire for self-preservation, he went back to clicking his rosary beads. Night had fallen, and still we awaited the order to attack. We were in a state of nervous expectation, which only those who have experienced can know what it's like. Private Vial in my squad hurt his hand while opening and closing the breech of his rifle. The blood flowed, and Sergeant F., the one who had denounced me as an anti-militarist, accused him of having wounded himself on purpose and hauled him before the captain. Despite Vial's vehement protests, he was sent back to the squad. It was 9 p.m. We'd been waiting for 4 hours, bayonets fixed, for them to pronounce the two terrible words, "En avant, forward." What did this long wait mean? No one knew, but along came our friend Gayrod, making his way up the Boyau to rejoin the 13th Squad and, guessing our deep anxiety, determined to tell us what he knew. "There's some good news," he said. "The 23rd Company, who were supposed to launch the attack, refused to march. Their captain, Darnaudy, from La Redoute, and the section chiefs went to explain the situation to the commandant. They're telephoning to the colonel and to Nisel. But the general demanded that the attack take place, making Captain Darnaudy responsible for it being carried out. Therefore he threw himself over the top, all alone, and fell at 10 paces from the trench, gravely wounded. He had an arm amputated. The attack was finally postponed to another time, and we put Rosalie back into her scabbard. They passed out picks and shovels to us, and we spent the night digging a communication trench. We didn't want to attack, so have us dig a trench no matter where. That will teach us to play games when we're supposed to be marching to massacre. At daybreak, our commandant Kins Grams sent the battalion adjutant, the Périacois François Calvet, to check on the work we had done. He had barely entered the trench when a stray bullet tore up his right shoulder quite badly, 1 centimetre closer, and there would have been one less Périacois in the world. Our pal Calvet was hardly bothered by this. "My wound might save the lives of others," he said, "because before I'm evacuated I'll say in my report that this Boyau is in full view of the Boche and open to enfilading fire." We had worked 10 hours for nothing, but this thought of Calvet's showed a generosity of spirit that many others, in the emotion of being wounded and the joy of getting out of these bad places, would not have had. They sent us to take 24 hours of so-called rest in the front-line trench, and what rest? Work details all day long, and at night the company got orders to bury the dead who lay between the lines since the assaults of September 25th, 26. The dead men were divided into lots, and we drew for them by squad. For the 13th Squad I drew a lucky hand. We only had 6 corpses to get rid of, and they were very close to the trench. We got the work done quickly. You pushed the cadaver into a shell hole, tossed a few shovelfuls of earth on top, and onto the next one. As corporal I had to take off each one's identity tag. Some had it on their wrists, others hanging around their necks, or in a pocket. What a chore. To dig through a dead man's pockets, pat him down, and with a knife or scissors cut the cord or the chain which held the identity tag. It seemed like a profanation to us, and we spoke in whispers as if we were afraid of waking them up. The squad that had to take care of the corpses in the Boyau itself, the ones we had been tramping over for 3 days, took all night to accomplish its lugubrious task, digging out the half-crushed, broken, collapsed bodies, mixed in with dirt, musette bags, knapsacks, which for many formed a single blood-soaked muddy mass. And when this work was done, we didn't even have a drop of water for washing our hands. We had to rub them with dirt to clean them a little bit. But our initial repugnance softened. Living in filth, we became worse than animals. The next morning, October 1st, our section went to take up its post in the same boyau. Each squad took the up-front position in turn. The 13th had to be there from 7 p.m. until midnight. A simple barricade of sandbags was the French border at this point. We had the bad luck that during our turn at guard, the order came to move this barricade forward. Maybe it was so that they could say in the next day's communiqué that, in Artois, we had made forward progress. Were the Germans nearby? How far ahead were they? Wouldn't they fall upon us, massacre us during our work, in this night which was so dark you couldn't have seen a cow at 2 paces, even with eyes like ours, habituated more to a nocturnal life than one by daylight? We need a volunteer, I said, to be a lookout, a couple of paces ahead of us. But it was truly frightening, this dark, mysterious trench where we knew there were Germans up ahead. At first nobody offered his devoted service, but then the Abbé Galop accepted this dangerous post and waited out there alone, as a sentinel while the barricade was being erected. At 4 the next morning we were relieved and sent back to a reserve position near the ruins of Neuville-Saint-Vaast. That night we could finally bed down in individual holes dug into the slope of a sunken road which led into the village. Since September 25th, we had only 1 hour of sleep at a time. 7 consecutive nights of watch, of work, of burying the dead. Meanwhile, the 13th Squad, despite its ill-fated number 13, came back from these skirmishes without having lost 1 man. But the next day, Private Gerard was wounded by a stray bullet in the leg, carrying a load of water from Neuville. The stretcher-bearers who came to pick him up told us that the regiment was losing, on average, 10 men a day, killed or wounded. But if we had listened to that clown Niesel and attacked like mad the way he told us to, it's likely that we'd have lost 100 men a day instead of 10. In the night of October 4th 5, we were sleeping soundly in our holes when we were rudely awakened by cries of, "To arms! Alert! Everybody up! Hoist your packs! 2 men from each squad take grenades. 2 more take cartridges. 2 more for rations. Let's go on the double." "My God," the Abbé Galop asked me, "what's going on now?" "Well, it must be some business of Niesel's, we'll see," I replied. In fact, we soon learned that a general attack was to be launched at daybreak. At 2 in the morning we were posted up near the front line, in a communication trench so narrow that we could neither sit nor crouch down. The rain came down in torrents. It seemed as if they had forgotten about us there. Around noontime, our bosses remembered that we hadn't had any food since the meagre supper of the evening before, and generously authorized us to eat our rations. Those who had jackal's teeth could nibble at their biscuits, already gnawed on by rats, which we carried in our packs, and that was all. They weren't giving chocolate yet, and we couldn't eat beans, rice, coffee and sugar, since our biped stomachs weren't able to digest these foods uncooked. It was just to make fun of us. All we could do was to tighten our belts a notch, and everything would be fine. Under the lashing downpour which addled our brains, emptied our minds of all conscious thought, we waited, immobile and silent. An almost total calm reigned. No volleys, an occasional cannon fired to break the silence, but it was muted, deafened by the fog, resonating like the ringing of a distant gong. Finally, around 5 in the afternoon, I heard someone say, "Pass this note to Corporal Barthas." Vaguely worried, I wondered what someone would want from me in this ditch. But as soon as I cast my eyes on this note, I was reassured. It was our good comrade Guéraud who was sending us some inside news about the situation, in a few sentences scribbled down in haste. The 5th Battalion was supposed to launch the attack, but its commandant, de Fagioli, judging success to be impossible, emphatically refused to attack, despite the anger and exasperation of Niesel. The attack didn't take place. We're going to pull back to Maroui. It wasn't our own cowardly commandant, Kins Grams, who would have dared resist the terrible Niesel. Soon our torture came to an end. For 15 hours we had been at a half-crouch, our limbs stiffened by such long immobility. But our joy gave us wings and legs to carry us, half dead with fatigue, to Mareuil at 9 in the evening after 3.5 hours of marching. We wandered around the village for an hour, searching for some sort of billet, since no one expected our arrival. Our section ended up bunking in a hovel half demolished by shells, but nobody complained. It was so bad where we had come from that we all slept at least as soundly as Niçel in his chateau, if not better. We spent 4 days of rest in Mareuil. One evening I attended a religious service at the church, honouring Saint Berthilde or Berthile, whose relics drew pilgrimages to Mareuil, because this saint had the reputation of healing illnesses of the eyes, a bad region for eye doctors with a competitor like that. A few days earlier, a big shell had fallen on the church and exploded in the choir, pulverizing everything except the glass reliquary containing the saint's bones. Miracle? Accident? Of course, for the curate of Mareuil there was no doubt. This was a genuine miracle. At the service I attended, he affirmed that this was the 3rd time these relics had escaped complete destruction, during the 100 Years' War, the Revolution of 1789, and now in 1915. On October 9th, the 280th Regiment received the order to move back up to the front line, since you can imagine that Niçel wasn't going to let us have 6 months of rest. At 7 in the evening we were already assembled, ready to move out, when a counter-order arrived, and to our great surprise they sent us off in the opposite direction, away from Neuville-Saint-Vaast. At the end of an hour-and-a-half march, we could see some lights twinkling in the dark. We were arriving at the village of Agnay-les-Duisans, where we were to be billeted. Our fourier, quartermaster, told us that the 21st Company was going to be lodged in the outbuildings of the chateau, where Niçel had installed himself as Lord of the Manor. This news made us happy. Certainly, we thought, a campsite right under the eyes of the division's general must be equipped with all the comforts we could desire. But how great was our disappointment when they stuck us in a stable, with a thick layer of manure covering the whole floor. 100 men would have had trouble lying down in there. They were piling up 250, and we also had to make room for 50 sappers. In vain I looked all around for a barn, a pigsty, any sort of shelter suitable for spending the night. I found nothing. I was forced to go back to the stable, where we arrayed ourselves as best we could, one on top of another, in every position. We could hardly sleep at all because someone was always coming in or going out, which couldn't be done without trampling on someone and provoking angry shouts, complaints and threats from those being stepped upon. As soon as day broke, a large number of us went out into the courtyard and started into vigorous calisthenics to battle against the bitter cold. We made quite a racket, like true southerners who never lose their petulance. We thought about nothing but Niçel sleeping comfortably in his fine bed, and that we were troubling his sleep, or his profound strategic meditations, or his love-making, because it was said that Niçel and the pretty lady of the manor. But that was none of our business. Suddenly a door of the chateau burst open, and the general appeared, bareheaded, with an angry scowl, and cried out in an irritated voice, "Would you please shut up, or I'll have you sent to the trenches right away. Go back to bed and get some rest." He was talking to us just as a master talks to his dogs. He was granting us permission to go to bed, without deigning to think about whether there was any place to do that. The next morning, the general was in a better mood. He came into the courtyard with packets of 1-penny pencils, which he handed out to some baffled soldiers, telling them, "Here, fellows, distribute these to your comrades." "This distribution of pencils doesn't tell me anything worth knowing," I said to my comrades in the squad. "You'll see that Niçel is preparing some sort of unhappy surprise for us." In fact, at 10:30, we had barely finished our meals when the order was given to leave immediately for the trenches. Along the way, the officers told us that the 280th Regiment was going to support a divisional attack. When we had passed beyond Neuville-Saint-Vaast, the Germans unleashed a violent barrage upon us. We fell back upon Neuville in hasty flight. "Ah," they'll say, "those southerners, always ready to turn tail." But in our ranks were Parisians and Bretons, and I noticed that they scampered along as quickly as we did. Commandant Kinsgrams and the Kronprinz, at the moment that the firing began, were passing in front of a big shelter, where they immediately sought refuge. When calm returned, they sent out their servants, or I should say their orderlies, to gather us up. This wasn't easy, since we were widely scattered. The attack took place, but 2 sections of the 281st Regiment who went over the top from the trenches were immediately cut down by machine guns. In spite of repeated orders from Niesel, no one else wanted to go out. At 7 in the evening, our company went up to reinforce the 281st Regiment. We occupied a communication trench which was badly damaged by shellfire. We had to spend the night in the open, despite frequent volleys of shells which the Germans haphazardly sent over onto our lines. Another bad night to be engraved on our memories. The next day, October 12th at 9 p.m., we went back to the front line, relieving the 281st Regiment. Arriving at the firing line, we noticed assault ladders placed every 10 metres along the parapet. This sight made us shiver, just as if we were walking past the gallows. In our trench were the remnants of a German heavy artillery battery, completely wiped out by our own artillery, shells, equipment and German corpses, all buried together. Night and day, they put us to work excavating the dugouts in this strong point. Right behind and in front of the firing line there were large numbers of dead, in proportion of about 1 German for every 20 Frenchmen. The latter belonged to the 50th Infantry Regiment. This advance had cost us dearly, 700 or 800 metres, which didn't really gain us anything. We were facing enemy trenches, which were just as solidly defended as the ones which we had taken. Under cover of the thick fog which covered the landscape each morning, some of us went out to find rifles, revolvers, etc. A few of the less scrupulous went through the pockets of the dead men. One morning, Corporal Cathala of our company, out in the open on such a mission, was hit by a bullet which wounded him gravely in the thigh, leading to a subsequent amputation. He dragged himself back to the trench, where they staunched his wound. He was lying on ground, soaked in his own blood. All of a sudden, here was General Niesel, whom we saw often in the trenches at daybreak, when all was calm. "Ah," said the general, "where was this corporal wounded?" We couldn't tell him that he had been pilfering the pockets of dead men, so we said it was at an observation post. "Find me the captain. Are you satisfied with this soldier's conduct?" he asked our captain, nicknamed the Kronprinz, who had quickly appeared on the scene. "Yes, very satisfied," stammered our captain. "Very well. He will be commended and will get the Croix de Guerre and the Médaille Militaire." And that's how Corporal Cathala became a hero. The Abbé Galop was haunted for some time by the desire to find a German rifle with a saw-toothed bayonet attached to take home as a souvenir. The Germans had one of these in each squad, in case it was needed to cut a branch, saw up a wooden plank, etc. Of course, they would occasionally put it on the end of a rifle to cut through a thorax or a belly. It served double duty. Father Galop, in search of this combination weapon tool, went out into the fog each morning, at the risk of intercepting a bullet along the way. One day, he told me that if I wanted a revolver and a nice pair of binoculars, he would point them out to me. The next day, accepting this offer, I went to the place he indicated, where an enormous shell had exploded right in the middle of a group of French soldiers mounting an assault, decapitating and frightfully mutilating a dozen men, who were now nothing more than bloody scraps. I spotted the binoculars and the revolver on the ground, still in their leather cases. I quickly grabbed them and fled, appalled by the horrible scene. With the help of these binoculars, the Abbé Galop ended up finding the object of his desire, a precious saw-toothed bayonet at the end of a rifle held by a dead German, a few paces from the trench, tangled up in a mass of barbed wire. You'd have to be crazy to want to go out, even at night, to look for a weapon like this, risking 9 chances out of 10 to be killed for a bayonet, even a saw-toothed one. Probably no man in the regiment would have attempted it. Well, this priest tried it. The following night he crept out, succeeded in getting his fascinating bayonet, and came back without arousing the attention of the Germans. But while he was coming back, he lost his way and stumbled upon a listening post of a neighbouring company, where 2 sentinels fired on him but missed. At the very moment that he got away from this post, a 105mm shell fell right onto it, killing the 2 sentinels. The Abbé Galop offered profound thanks to Providence, which favoured him in this rash enterprise and kept him safe from such serious dangers. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Malvesi cast envious eyes upon my new binoculars and brazenly proposed that I exchange them for his own, which weren't worth 40 sous. I refused. He insisted. I refused even more emphatically. He didn't waste much time exacting petty vengeance on me. On October 17th, at 9 in the evening, a shell burst about 30 metres from our position, right in the trench, killing outright 2 unfortunate rationers bringing food up for their squad. One of them was my poor comrade Vieux from Muscabard, who had come up as a replacement in July. He was attached to my squad at first, but after a while he was transferred to the 18th Company, where his brother was a rationer for officers. This brother was also killed a short time afterward. These were 2 good, sincere socialist militants from Muscabard. The war had positive results for the capitalist bourgeoisie. During this stint at the front lines, our neighbouring company, the 18th, was sorely tested. They had a score of killed or wounded, while our company only had 3 wounded. That was because we were so close to the Germans that their artillerymen didn't dare pound on us, in fear of hitting their own trenches. One day, Father Galop was firing the German rifle he had picked up, out of his loophole, like a madman. I warned him, "Who lives by the sword will die by the sword." The Germans, who had gone for many hours without firing a single shot, began to reply to Father Galop's fusillade. They soon discovered the loophole from which the rifle fire was coming, and right away a bullet passed through the narrow opening and shattered the wrist of the fighting priest, before going through his helmet and grazing his forehead. He was taken to the first aid station and then evacuated to Royaumont, from where he sent us greetings and best wishes. The last day of this frontline assignment, at dawn, General Niesel came up to the trenches. He stopped first at the neighbouring company, the 18th, which my squad was in contact with. I heard him chewing out a sentry who had made no sign of respect to his august personage. "In the trenches," he cried. "I don't require a full rule-book salute, but at least take a deferential attitude." It must be said that away from the trenches, the general didn't fool around when it came to the exterior signs of respect. He required that you salute when his staff car went by, whether he was in it or not. On this occasion, Commandant de Fagiols, who was also making his morning rounds, came face to face with Niesel. At sight of the commandant, the general exploded in anger. He clearly had not pardoned him for refusing to have his battalion massacred at the regiment's last assault. "Look at the Boche, Commandant. What work they've done over the past 2 weeks, and we've done nothing. And I mean to change that. Every day I want a detailed report on all the work that's done, and I'll come verify it myself." At a humble interruption by his interlocutor, Niesel shouted so loudly that the Boche must have heard him. "I'm not asking for your advice. I'm giving you an order." Then, getting more and more worked up, "And tell your men that we have to get the Boches out of here. We have to attack, if not today, then tomorrow. You'll get the order." If it was up to him, it wouldn't have dragged out much longer. And then, casting a scornful eye on the ragged, muddy, dirty men who had gathered around him out of curiosity, he said, "Look at these outfits. You'd think they were a bunch of militiamen. I could have done more with a section of my old Zouaves than with your whole regiment." Brusquely, the general turned to me and said angrily, "Have you passed the word that I am here? It's been 20 minutes and no one has come to meet me." "Excuse me, General. I told my sergeant that you were here." "So that's how your captain takes care of business. We'll go have a look." But as for me, I couldn't go have a look, which was too bad. Our captain, Master Cross-Merivier, had to take the heat, according to his rank. This devil of a general mistreated his officers like simpletons, with no regard for their stripes. The same day we learned that, contrary to the wishes of General Niesel, the offensive was being halted everywhere, and that furloughs and leaves were going to begin. What a sigh of relief! What a weight fell from our shoulders! In spite of our fatigue, our joy gave us such wings, or such legs, that we arrived at Mareuil at 1 in the morning, having found neither the road too long nor our packs too heavy. Starting the next day, each company had to form a section specialized in throwing grenades. It was understood that preference would go to young, vigorous men. In our section, Sub-Lieutenant Malvesi, who was assigned to choose the Grenadier section's corporal, quickly chose me, despite the fact that of the 4 corporals I was the eldest. That was no doubt to teach me a lesson for having finer binoculars than his own. I could have complained, but I told myself that up at the listening posts, where the Grenadiers would be located, I would be more favourably posted, more exposed to grenades and to surprise attacks, but less exposed to shells and mortar rounds than I would be farther to the rear. So I left my good comrades in the squad and joined the Grenadier section. The next day of our sojourn at Mareuil, they put us to work in the front lines, digging a boyau. Heading out at 6 in the evening, we arrived back at 4 in the morning, worn out because we'd had to cover 20 kilometres in all. They called that being at rest. There was one of us who didn't come back, having been killed outright by a stray bullet. Nobody wept over him. Who deserved to be mourned, him or us? During the day we kept busy by tossing stones instead of grenades, from morning to night, along the banks of the River Scarpe, to build up our throwing arms. But by the end of 4 days we had all wrenched our shoulders out. On October 23rd, at 6 in the evening, we went to billet at Agnes for 4 more days. This time we were lodged not at Niesel's chateau, but at another one in the middle of the village. They bunked us in piles of hay with, for our pillows, bunches of straw where legions of ticks and fleas swarmed. This chateau was a true nest of shirkers for the whole division: telephone operators, stenographers, stretcher-bearers, gendarmes. All of these folks naturally occupied the best spots and looked upon us with visible disdain. One afternoon, General Niesel summoned all the sergeants and corporals for a conference about our role in the trenches during the upcoming winter campaign. We were assembled in a schoolroom. The general welcomed us with a big smile, all jolly and perky. This was no longer the terrible brawler who dreamed only of cuts and bruises, assaults and combats. "Well," he said with a twinkle in his eye, "you're all good sturdy fellows. With men like you we can get something done. I like the way you look and how you handle yourselves." After this flattering preamble, the general told us, "You know that this coming winter we're not going to let the Boches sit comfortably in their holes. We're going to bother them all the time, and here's how." And in front of a blackboard, chalk in hand, Niesel explained to us, for 2 whole hours, how to dig an approach trench to take a listening post or a trench, how to get close enough to the enemy to throw grenades, wham bam bam, and he concluded each sentence with the words, "It'll be easy." In fact, it looked easy, even too easy, child's play. You'd hardly know that we were talking about killings, throat cuttings, massacres. Then Niesel deigned to thank us for our required attention and headed off to his chateau, persuaded no doubt that he had excited our warrior spirit and patriotic sentiments. How wrong he was. On October 25th, before we went back to the trenches, it was decided that in order to get us back into proper disciplinary shape, we would take a long march during which the rules would be observed strictly. With Sergeant Lasserre, head of the company's grenadiers, being away on furlough, I was promoted, against my best wishes, to be temporary head of what was called the elite section. It was actually the one to which each squad had sent its biggest malcontents. In spite of rainy weather, we set out at noon, the grenadiers in line of march. Expecting to meet Niesel, the scourge of officers, our captain declared that he was insisting on perfect marching order as we passed through Agnes-les-Duisans. It was our bad luck that as we came out of our encampment, 3 or 4 trucks in a row crossed our path and cut the company's grenadier section in 2. There was a gap of about 50 metres separating the half which had gone ahead from our half, which was left behind. I begged my grenadiers to pick up the pace and catch up to the rest of the column before the captain saw what had happened. Some ran, others galloped, but half continued at the normal pace. The result? Indescribable disorder. And here is the captain who looks back and gives us a furious look. I tried to explain that our column had been cut by trucks crossing, but this only exasperated him. For a full half hour he put us through close order drills, making us repeat the same manoeuvres 4, 5, 10 times, me along with the men. Finally, he himself got tired of giving us orders, and he let us alone and went off to bother other sections or the whole company. It was a steady stream of whistle blasts, moving from route pace to cadenced pace, forming squares, etc., all accompanied by fastidious run-through of the manual of arms. With his horse, he made us keep the left side of the road wide open. We had to keep to the edge of the road, even if there were big puddles or mud holes, all because it was written in the rule book. Passing through the village of Montecourt, the grenadier section came back into his good graces. We seemed to have paraded in an impeccable fashion, while the others had marched like a bunch of firemen. To reward us, he let us march at a normal walking pace, while the others had to step briskly at a cadenced pace with arms shouldered. It was the grenadiers' turn to have some fun. Not all of them, however. For example, Grenadier Seguiel, who got 4 days in prison for being so rash as to puff on his pipe, which he kept hidden in his left hand when we were marching at cadenced pace. This was not to be believed, and the captain was pitiless. Likewise for another who couldn't hold his tongue, forgetting that at cadenced pace you're supposed to be quiet as a carp. On October 28th, at 5 in the afternoon, we headed out again, accompanied by cold downpours, to occupy reserve trenches near Neuville-Saint-Vaast. We were drenched by these steady rains, slipping and stumbling along almost impassable roads and paths in the dark night. They finally stopped bothering us with their stupid rules and marching orders. Cursing, grumbling, complaining, each one of us marched along, dragging himself forward as best he could. To arrive where? In gloomy Boyau, full of mud, where we argued with each other over half-collapsed holes which our predecessors had dug. Only the officers had halfway decent shelters at their disposal. A few slabs of sheet metal, some planks placed across the top of the trench and covered with earth, would have been enough to give us a shelter, if not comfortable, at least sufficient to protect us from the glacial wind and the downpours. But no. There, like practically everywhere else, nothing had been planned for, nothing had been ordered, by some colonel or other, or by Generalissimo Joffre, to shelter the human cattle against the bad weather. 2 days later, at nightfall, our company went up to occupy a second-line trench called the Tranchée du Moulin. There had indeed been a mill in the vicinity, but I spotted only the remains of it 3 days later, a few bricks sticking out of the earth and mud. The miller will have a fit when he comes back. At the emplacement occupied by the grenadier section, there was only a single shelter for all of us. It had been dug by the Germans, who started digging a mine there. Unfortunately, our advance had interrupted their work, and all that was left was a staircase with about 40 steps dug into the earth. At the bottom was a shallow, narrow corridor where, because so little air got down that far, candles wouldn't even stay lit. There was so little room that we had to leave our weapons, rifles and packs outside on the firing step, at the mercy of the rain and any larcenous souls. Those who find their bedrooms not spacious or comfortable enough should consider whether 40 men were comfortable on this narrow, muddy, slippery staircase, where every moment someone was either going up or coming down, and there wasn't room for 2 slightly overweight men to pass each other. Luckily, we were all pretty thin. The opening of this cave faced the enemy, and it was quite possible that an errant shell could come bouncing down the staircase and make a bloody grenadier omelette. But we didn't give this a second thought. We were familiar with mortal danger. Besides, we weren't gathering any moss in this dead-end spot. On the captain's behalf, morning and night, an orderly came and put us into work details. We had to carry out our chores in the rain. Since we had arrived at the Tranchée du Moulin, it rained almost without stopping. On November 2nd, it really came down in torrents. The trenches were transformed into open sewers. That day, at nightfall, in full deluge, I received the order to put all the grenadiers to work cleaning out the boyau which led to the front lines, all through the night. A stupid, senseless, barbarous order. To work in a night of opaque, tomb-like darkness, in icy water, in mud, on a task which was hopeless as long as the rain fell. It was too much, and the men declared that they didn't want to work. I scribbled a couple of lines on the back of the written order brought by the orderly, telling the captain the reasons why we would do better to wait for the rain to stop. A half-hour later I received another note, this one a veritable ultimatum, ordering me to begin work immediately. I was responsible for the execution of this order, and the captain himself would be coming up to see that it would be carried out. By the light of an electric lamp, I wrote my response. Captain, I know the limits of work, of effort, of fatigue which one can ask of a man. My conscience won't allow me to go beyond those limits. Either grant me that, or give my command to someone else." A minute later, the orderly, soaked to the skin by these multiple excursions in the trench transformed into a canal, brought me the order to present myself before the captain immediately. The captain was installed in a deep shelter, a dozen steps below ground. Seated at a little table, he was enjoying a peaceful game of cards with Lieutenant Moret. To the side, a brazier threw off lovely warmth, and an aide was heating up the teapot. What a difference between these officers' situation and our own. "Corporal," the captain said dryly, "by order of the commandant, you have to put your men to work all night long to keep the Boyo passable up to the front lines. Go to it." "Captain, as long as the rain is coming down in torrents, I'm not going to have my men out there working, because their efforts would be useless, and all their fatigue, their suffering would be for nothing. And besides, they wouldn't obey me. I repeat, it's the commandant's order. And I repeat that this order can't be carried out. Please give the command of the Grenadier section to another non-com. It's not for me, a simple corporal, to be in charge." The captain stood up in a rage. "Corporal Barthas, for the last time, I'm demanding that you execute this order. I'm holding you responsible. I'll come to see for myself. Now get out of here." A quarter hour later, after almost stumbling and drowning in the torrential rain, I found myself in front of the narrow entrance to our staircase, where everyone was so tightly packed that anyone who went out wouldn't find a place again. Completely soaked, I was shivering. My teeth were chattering. Was I going to die of cold, of exhaustion in this gloomy boyau? To my physical distress was added moral distress. This order to put men to work, to throw them out of their shelter, into the mud, the gloom, the storm, the icy water, these 40 men already frozen right through, filled my head with storms of rage, of hate-filled anger against these inhuman orders. My decision was made. I would defy the captain's and the commandant's orders. The men would stay in their shelter, but maybe tomorrow I would be arrested for refusing to obey an order and dragged before a court-martial. They could even be scoundrels enough to have me shot, as an example. No, not that. They won't get me. Crazy thoughts invaded my brain. Before dying, I would go back to the captain's lair and skewer him with my bayonet like an ill-behaved beast. Then I thought about how, at the bottom of the staircase, candles wouldn't stay lit, and no one dared go to sleep down there, preferring to pile up on the stairs. Well, I would go down there, and by tomorrow I would likely be asphyxiated. That would be a nice, painless death, the end of this cruel life. The thought of my loved ones didn't hold me back. I had long ago given up any hope of seeing them again. I made my way down the narrow staircase, stepping on and slipping on feet, legs, backs, bellies, provoking angry growls and grumbles directed at me. Finally I got to the bottom. I had my pack with me, and I took off my dripping clothes and wrapped myself in my blanket, as if in a shroud, and stretched out on the damp ground, abandoned myself to the sleep of the dead. Around midnight, someone roughly shook me awake by the shoulders. "Let me die in peace," I cried out. "Are you crazy?" said the captain's orderly. "Here, read this paper." And by the light of an electric lamp, I read that the captain was demanding that I give an account of the work accomplished so far. On a scrap of paper I wrote that the men were at work on such and such a trench. I knew that the orderly was a good comrade and wouldn't betray me. At daybreak, the rationers left for La Targette, where the field kitchens arrived to distribute coffee, hooch and breakfast. The staircase emptied out, and the men shook themselves awake in the trench, the rain having finally ceased. The men knew that I had refused to make them work at night, in the rain. With scoops and shovels, they went to work with a burst of energy and enthusiasm. Around 10 o'clock, the commandant and our captain, booted up to their bellies, came to pay us a visit. The captain looked at me with a suspicious eye. "So this is what you've done since last evening," he said to me, "with 40 men." He didn't press the matter further, and that's how I got out of this scrape. The steady rain brought on landslides, which uncovered many French cadavers alongside our trench, which had been taken on September 25th. They had been tossed out of the trench and insufficiently covered with a bit of dirt. It wasn't unusual to be grabbed, while passing, by a skeletal hand or a foot sticking out of the trench wall. We were so blasé about it that we paid it no more attention than to a root we might trip upon in our path. Finally, on November 6th, at 6 o'clock in the evening, the 281st Regiment came to relieve us, to pull us out of this hellhole, and we went back to Agnes until the 13th. There were daily downpours, but at the slightest sign of clear weather, of course, we were sent out on the usual stupid exercises, which started up again. On November 13th at nightfall, we left for Mareuil and stayed there 6 days in reserve. During the day I had washed out my shirt, which was thick with lice, and I now was looking around the courtyard of our cantonment for a sunny spot in which to spread it out to dry. I noticed for the first time in a corner an old carriage dating back to the Restoration, or even the First Empire. Under this carriage was an old piece of cloth which I pulled out with a stick. What did I find inside but 2 plump hens, which some shameless poilu had no doubt sacrificed that very morning and was awaiting nightfall to take them away. I quickly alerted my fellow grenadier Seguail. He was a sly rascal who affirmed that since in wartime we were permitted and even ordered to kill, it was a minor peccadillo to wring the neck of a duck, hen, or rabbit. Furthermore, he was an excellent chef who could teach a cordon bleu a thing or two. In spite of the continual coming and going in the courtyard, it was child's play for Seguail to take charge of these 2 hens and spirit them away in his knapsack and musette bag. That evening in Mareuil, in a house half demolished but with its kitchen intact, Seguail skillfully cooked up the 2 birds in mess tins, and with 2 other comrades we enjoyed an excellent repast, savouring a double pleasure, that of a good meal and the delight of having outsmarted a thief. Each night at Mareuil we had to go dig or clean out boyaux leading up to the front lines. They were long and tiring, these starless, moonless nights, which a thick fog made even gloomier. To improve our routine in the trenches a little bit, they gave us hardly anything to eat back in the rear. Try working or marching all night and keeping your spirits up on an empty stomach. And meanwhile, nice and warm, with full bellies, our officers drank, sang, enjoyed themselves in the village. It was revolting, and it ended up leading the men to revolt. At 6 in the evening came the usual assembly, called by the officer of the day, or rather the evening. Only the grenadier section didn't move. Everyone claimed to be sick. Called out individually, many got scared and declared themselves cured. The others were sent before the medical officer, a worthy disciple of his predecessor and former boss Torres. It was Dr. Colombes from Durigny. We had already digested our meagre pittance, but he was still enjoying his supper with the battalion officers. He stood up, furious at being bothered like this. "Ah, here are the laggards who don't want to work. We'll see about them," he said. Of course, not one was accepted into sick bay. Headaches, colic, back pains, etc. All were met with the same answer. Not accepted. Refusing to work, now that was serious. Prison for sure, perhaps a court-martial. Only one, Private X, persisted in claiming to be ill and went to bed. The rest left, but in a sign of protest they crossed the village singing the Internationale, which will always be the hymn of the oppressed, the unfortunate ones for whom it is an expression of discontent and of hope.